There's a reason Generation X perceives the world differently, and it's not merely nostalgia. We've examined the mindset of those who grew up between specific decades, but today, we're exploring something deeper. Let's begin with something that would be prohibited today. Picture yourself at 6 years old sitting in the front bench seat of your father's car. No seatbelt, no booster seat, just you on vinyl upholstery, against your bare legs with open road stretching ahead. Your position grants complete control over the radio dial. You're spinning through static, hunting for that perfect song. But the real prize comes when your father glances over and pats his lap. You slide across the bench, climb up, and wrap both small hands around the enormous steering wheel. He controls the pedals. You control direction. The broken white lines disappear beneath the hood one by one, and you're guiding every single one. By contemporary standards, this would be considered irresponsible. But you didn't perceive this as reckless because in that moment you weren't just a child. You were someone trusted with responsibility. Safety regulations back then were more like gentle suggestions. Nobody wore seatbelts. Most people questioned why they even existed. Here's another scenario impossible today. Your mother pulls up outside shops and tells you to wait in the car. She'll only be 5 minutes. You watch her disappear through doors. 5 minutes becomes 10. 10 becomes 20. You're watching strangers walk past, fogging up windows with your breath, drawing shapes in condensation. Today's safety is a notification on screens, a green dot on tracking apps, or a text when you arrive. But you built an internal compass in a supermarket parking lot while your mother shopped. You learned that safety wasn't a status update. It was a feeling you carried in your gut. Once you possessed that internal compass, the neighborhood became your kingdom. It wasn't merely a collection of houses. It was vast territory belonging entirely to you and your friends. Consider the woods at the street's end or that vacant lot behind shops. By today's standards, these were dangerous, neglected spaces. But to you, they were birthplaces of independence. You'd spend entire afternoons building forts from whatever you could find. You'd drag home discarded plywood, heavy carpet remnants left curbside, and milk crates borrowed from behind grocery stores. There were no instructions, no adults to assist. You were learning raw physics through trial and error. You discovered that without overlapping roof boards, rain came in. You felt the sting of splinters and learned to extract rusty nails from lumber with a hammer's back. You walked home with dirt under fingernails and scrapes on shins, but you also walked home with builder's pride. You'd created your own world, a secret place where no trespassing signs didn't apply to you. This was your first lesson in handling people without parental mediation. You and your friends had to figure everything out yourselves. You had to decide who got the best fort seat or who handled lookout duty. If you couldn't cooperate, the game ended and you were stuck home alone. You learned negotiation, compromise, and when to stand your ground. You were building character in the woods while parents thought you were simply playing. And then there was the bike. Your bicycle wasn't just a toy, it was your horse, your escape pod, your first taste of real power. You'd spend hours customizing it. You'd clip playing cards to spokes with clothespins to make it roar like a motorcycle. You'd wrap handlebars in colorful electrical tape or add a banana seat with tall sissy bar. You knew every shortcut through alleyways and every jump made from propped plywood and bricks. You didn't need maps or phones to find friends. You just looked for the pile of bikes dumped on a front lawn. That was the universal signal that something was happening. You weren't following blue dots on GPS. You were following shouting sounds, fresh-cut grass smells, and late afternoon's long shadows. You weren't just moving through the neighborhood. You were mastering it. You're flying down a hill on your bike, feet off pedals, wind in your face. The front wheel catches a rock. You go over handlebars. You hit pavement hard, gravel biting into palms, blood already running down your shin. You limp home, knee throbbing. You walk through the door. Your mother takes one look, assesses, and says you're fine. Go wash it off and get back outside. So you do, and you wear that scab like a medal for 2 weeks. There were no elbow pads, no knee pads, no helmets. Most kids couldn't even find helmets in shops if they wanted them. But we didn't just invite neighborhood kids over to play. We invited their viruses too. You'd walk into a living room full of barely known kids, all circling one miserable 7-year-old covered in red, itchy spots. This was a chickenpox party. The goal wasn't avoiding the virus. The goal was catching it, getting it over with, building immunity, moving on. Mothers stood in kitchens drinking coffee while their children shared cups and toys with actively contagious kids on purpose. This created anti-fragility that's disappearing today. You learned early that hurt and damaged are two different things, a distinction generations raised in bubble wrap often struggle to make. Your neighborhood mastery didn't stop with shortcuts and forts. It extended to machines in your life too. You grew up in an era where things you owned weren't black boxes. You could see gears. You could smell grease. And most importantly, you were expected to understand how it all worked. Think about the first time your bike chain slipped or your tire went flat. You didn't wait for professionals or software updates. You flipped the bike upside down, balancing it on seat and handlebars. You got grease on palms and black streaks on your shirt while working the chain back onto the sprocket. You learned the feel of a wrench and exact pressure needed to tighten bolts without snapping them. By age 10, you weren't just a rider. You were a mechanic. That can-do mindset was everywhere. It was fundamental to the air you breathed. You watched your father under the car hood on Saturday mornings, leaning over the fender with a trouble light. You were tasked with holding the flashlight, learning part names like alternator, spark plugs, and carburetor. And when the television started flickering or VCR tracking went fuzzy, you didn't call help desks. You gave it a firm technical tap on the side. You'd climb behind the massive heavy cabinet to check cables, those red, white, and yellow plugs always tangled in dust nests. You learned that wiggling wires just right snapped the picture back into focus. You were building mechanical intuition, a belief that if something broke, figuring out why was your job. This created specific confidence that's becoming increasingly rare. You didn't feel helpless when the world didn't work perfectly. You assumed that with a screwdriver, some lubricant, and patience, you could master the physical world. But while tough enough to handle the world outside, you were smart enough to respect rules inside. Because when you weren't okay, consequences were swift. You mouth off at the dinner table. Before finishing the sentence, you hear it. The scrape of a wooden spoon being pulled from the drawer. You don't need to be told twice. We're not here to debate whether that was right or wrong. But psychologically, it created something specific, a direct understanding that actions have immediate, tangible consequences. Not conversations, not warnings, not timeouts. Clear cause and effect, and that wiring doesn't disappear. But if weekdays were about rules, weekends were about freedom. Saturday mornings were different. Saturday mornings were sacred. It's 6:30 in the morning. You're awake before anyone else. You plant yourself in front of the television in pajamas, cartoons for the next 4 hours. That television is a portal, and here's the thing. If you missed it, you missed it. No streaming, no catch-up. You had one chance, and you either made it or you didn't. This taught you something about time that's almost impossible to learn now. That some moments only come once. That being present matters. You grew up understanding that the world wasn't going to wait for you. Perhaps the most quiet, powerful lesson you learned was in the classroom. Education back then was analog, slow, and final. Without the internet in your pocket, your brain had to be the hard drive. Today, knowledge is a commodity, something you search for and immediately forget. But for you, if you wanted to know a historical date or a country's capital, you couldn't just look it up mid-sentence. You had to know it. You had to own that information. Think about the sound of the mimeograph machine. That rhythmic thump and swish as it produced purple-inked worksheets, still damp and smelling like chemicals. Today, students get PDFs on tablets with dozens of clickable links and distractions. But you had a pencil and a single piece of wide-ruled paper. If you made a mistake, you couldn't hit undo. You had to erase it, deal with a smudge, and keep going. This taught you that actions have weight. that you couldn't just reset your way out of a mess. This built a focus muscle almost impossible for kids to develop today. When writing an essay, you didn't have 20 tabs open for research. You didn't have notifications popping up every 30 seconds, pulling your attention away. You had your notes, your textbook, and your own thoughts. You learned how to follow a single thread of logic for an hour at a time. While today's world is addicted to the skim, you were trained for the deep dive. And then there was the library. Today, research is a 3-second search, requiring no physical effort. But back then, it was a hunt. You'd stand in front of wooden card catalogs, pulling out long, narrow drawers and flipping through thousands of typed cards. You were learning that information has a cost. It takes time, effort, and movement. Because you had to work for your knowledge, you valued it more. You earned it. While mastering the classroom, you were mastering the social world at the mall. Before the internet turned identity into digital profiles, the mall was your physical social media. It was the high-stakes laboratory where you learned how to exist in a crowd. Think about the ritual of being dropped off at the entrance with $10 in your pocket. You weren't there to shop, not really. You were there to see and be seen. You walked the circuit from food court to record store to arcade. Every step was a lesson in social navigation. You were learning how to read a room, how to tell who was friendly, who was trouble, and where you fit into the mix. This was the era of physical identity. If you wanted to be part of a subculture, you had to wear it. You chose your tribe through your clothes, the band shirts, the flannels, the scuffed boots, or the neon windbreakers. But here was the catch. You had to stand behind those choices in person. There was no hiding behind screens or curated feeds. If you dressed like a skater, you had to be able to talk and walk with other skaters in the real world. You couldn't just post an aesthetic. You had to live it. As you got older, that sense of independence took on new form. It wasn't just about where you could go on your bike anymore. It was about what you could earn. For Generation X, your first job wasn't a resume builder or supervised internship. It was a raw, unfiltered introduction to the adult world. Think about the paper route. If you were 12 or 13, this was your first contract. People relied on you to bring the world to their doorstep. You'd wake up at 5 in the morning while the house was silent and air was freezing. You'd sit on the garage floor folding heavy Sunday editions and snapping thick rubber bands around them. You'd load up a canvas bag weighing half as much as you did, slinging it over your shoulder before pedaling out into darkness. You learned weather in a way most people never do. You learned how to navigate a neighborhood by memory, hitting the same porch at the same time every single day. And once a month, you had to go collecting. You'd knock on doors, stand on porches, and look adults in the eye to ask for the money they owed. You were learning how to handle rejection, how to keep a ledger, and how to be responsible for a service. If the paper was wet, you heard about it. You weren't a child in those moments. You were a local businessman. And for those who didn't have roots, there was the fast food counter or local grocery store. This was before touch screens and automated kiosks. If you worked the register, you had to be fast with mental math. When machines jammed, you didn't panic. You grabbed a pen and pad of paper and calculated tax by hand. You were part of a team where the manager was often only 19 themselves. You learned the value of $1 because you knew exactly how many floors you had to mop or how many grocery bags you had to carry to earn it. There was no direct deposit appearing in apps. You were handed a physical paycheck. You walked it into a bank, stood in line, and felt the weight of that paper in your hand. This built grit that stays with you today. As you moved into teenage years, you entered a space that simply doesn't exist anymore. You were a latchkey kid, letting yourself into an empty house with a key around your neck. There was a note on the table, and for the next 4 hours, you were the master of your own time. Nobody was structuring your afternoon. Today, a kid's schedule is managed like a corporate merger: tutoring, sports, organized playdates. But you had the gift of boredom, and boredom is the birthplace of creativity. Every phone call was an exercise in social courage. You'd stand in the kitchen, stretching the tangled yellowed phone cord as far as it would go for a hint of privacy. You dialed home phones, not smartphones, because they didn't exist yet. You had to bypass the gatekeeper, also known as your friend's parents, before you could even speak to your friend. You had to use your polite voice, state your business, and navigate an adult conversation just to get a hang on, "I'll get them." You were learning how to handle authority figures before you were even out of middle school. And when you finally got out of the house on a Friday night, you disappeared into the dark. There was no GPS tracking your every move, no social media stories documenting your mistakes for eternity. If you did something foolish in a parking lot at midnight, only the people who were there knew about it. You had the freedom to be messy. You had the freedom to try on different versions of yourself without the pressure of a digital audience judging your every move. You were forming your identity in private, away from the constant noise of instant feedback. That patience applied to everything. It applied even to love. Think about the ritual of the mixtape. It was the ultimate love letter. You couldn't just share a link or a playlist. You had to sit there in real time watching the tape spin, hitting play and record with surgical precision. You'd spend hours curating the perfect track list, writing out the insert by hand, and perhaps even decorating the case. It was a massive investment of time and vulnerability. You were giving someone a physical piece of your effort, and because it was hard to make, it meant everything. All of these moments, the long waits, the physical efforts, and the lack of safety nets, were training you for the long game of life. Every time you look at the world today and feel like you've landed on a different planet, remember this: you're not outdated. You're carrying capabilities that are becoming extinct. While today's world is obsessed with performing for an audience, you are busy actually living. You developed a sense of self in a neighborhood without a digital footprint, and you learned to trust your own gut, because back then you had to. You carry a rare kind of quiet strength that comes from figuring out who you were without constant input. You've had that internal compass since the day you first grabbed that steering wheel, and you've been navigating your own path ever since.